Thank you, Will, for that warm and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming on a Friday. It's a lovely, gorgeous day outside, and I know that there are better things you could be doing. So anyway, let me start. Okay. We need to change okay, great. In most architectural histories of Bombay, native engineers are either ignored or summarily dispatched because they are not seen to be the originator of ideas, but rather functionaries who carried out orders. But is this all they were? Macaulay's Minute of 1835 articulated the aim to create through missionary education, quote, a class of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, end quote, or as Homi Baba dubs them, mimic men. I examine the role of one prominent Indian engineer and architect, Khan Bahadur Muncherji Kawasji Marzban, and dates for his life are 1839 to 1918. And he belongs to this class of interpreters and might offer us an early example of a mimic man. How does one examine Marzban's role in the construction of colonial Bombay? Is Marzban an ideal type of mimic man, someone who could imitate the architectural forms desired by the British in his designs and yet forge no independent path of his own? Or are there other, more revealing ways of analyzing the work of Marzban and others like him? In contrast to the construction of native engineers as more or less anonymous intermediaries who got the job done, Marzban's son represented his father's life as exemplary. While Marzban depicted his father's life as an object lesson in self-help, this talk shows that Marzban's life also offers us object lessons on the possibilities and limits of a native engineer of his time. Marzban worked in the Public Works Department, the PWD, from 1857 to 1893. He was appointed Executive Engineer Presidency, PWD, in 1884 and retired from the government in 1893 after a 36-year career in government service. In 1892, Marzban was appointed Executive Engineer of the Municipal Corporation of Bombay, a position he held for 11 years until his retirement in December 1903. In my estimation, there was no architect or engineer in the second half of the 19th century who could rival the length, the depth, and diversity of Marzban's almost half-century involvement in the construction of colonial Bombay's public buildings and infrastructure. And yet, Marzban is a relatively unexplored figure. Assistant engineers, who were usually natives, were often responsible for supervising the erection of buildings, so we usually only hear their names in passing. Vasudev Bapuji supervised the construction of the Secretariat, while Assistant Engineer Rao Bahadur Makund Ramchandra is thought to have done the sculptures on the Rajabai Tower that represented the various castes of Western India that you see in these images. Their names fleetingly appear in the pages of Bombay's history, and then they vanish with the exception of Marzban. So this talk seeks to revise the account of who built Bombay by focusing on Indian civil engineers who worked for the government and who also participated in the construction of major civic buildings that represented the Raj. They have long been neglected, not only because their work and biographies are not well documented, but also because they have no place in this narrative. Here, I will focus on the career of one individual, on the career of Marzban, and by personalizing colonial rule, I hope to complicate its working and experience. In his comparative study of urban space in colonial and post-colonial Africa, the cultural geographer Garth Andrew Myers introduced the idea of verandas of power, a phrase that he had borrowed from Elspeth Huxley, to conceptualize power as a three-tiered structure. The upper tier was occupied by the colonial elite, replaced by the colonized elite in the post-colonial state. The second tier housed the colonized middle, while the third tier consisted of the urban majority. Meyer's model helps to draw our attention to the colonized middle, who acted as intermediaries between the upper and lower levels in India. In India, the colonized middle was the class of interpreters between the Raj and the millions they ruled over. Bombay's British engineers and architects belonged to the colonial elite and occupied the top veranda, whereas Bombay's native engineers represented the colonized middle. The engineering department of the Bombay PWD, for example, might have a handful of British officials at the top, while most of the staff consisted of natives. And this photograph of the office holders of the Executive Engineer Presidency's office, PWD from 1893, when Marzaban was the executive engineer, does not seem to include any Europeans. So it was this silent and usually invisible native majority who carried out most of the work in the construction of public buildings and the infrastructure of colonial Bombay. Marzaban was both representative of individuals of the middle veranda and was at the same time distinct from other contemporary native engineers in Bombay, not only because of his remarkably successful career, but because of the extent of his multifaceted engagement with the city. Undoubtedly, Marzaban was a good engineer, but his rapid advancement can be attributed in part to his skill as an intermediary who interacted with powerful elites in a number of different forums. In his engineering career, he was aided in his rise by many British mentors who are mentioned in his biography. As a member of the Masonic Lodge, Marzaban would have met members of both the colonial and colonized elite. Marzaban was a Parsi, as were the majority of Bombay's philanthropists during the second half of the 19th century, allowing him to act as an effective intermediary between them and the colonial elite. He also sat on the board or was a committee member of various Parsi charities and hailed from a family that had a distinguished record of social reform in Bombay. On a professional basis, as the architect of many philanthropic institutions, as well as some community institutions, he had contacts with many powerful and wealthy Parsis. Furthermore, and most significantly, this interaction with Parsi philanthropists allowed him to emerge as a philanthropist in his own right, as well as an organizer of philanthropy towards special projects, hospitals and housing projects for the Parsi community, a topic I don't have actually time to discuss today, but just something to keep in mind. So part one, the place of the native engineer. For Indian engineers, even getting a job in the PWD was no mean achievement. Despite the many Victorian buildings he designed in Bombay, Marzaban's neglect by Britain's architectural press did not simply reflect racial prejudice, but disdain for the work of engineers and even architects in a general environment of limited interest in the empire. Figures such as John Lockwood Kipling, the artist, scholar, and professor of architectural sculpture at the J.J. School of Art in Bombay from 1865 to 1874, were also unsympathetic to the native engineer. As Kipling saw it, the classes of natives that were being educated in Western institutions were often the classes for whom foreign styles of architecture symbolized, quote, enlightenment and progress, end quote. He thought that native subordinates who worked at the PWD had only theoretical knowledge derived from books. Kipling cynically observed, quote, there are hundreds of them, indeed, earning relatively large salaries who are mere copyists and tracers, end quote, unlike the native craftsmen trained from childhood who had practical knowledge and were often proficient at several crafts. However, by the 1880s, well-trained men of the mystery class were not easily found and were especially difficult to find in the official centers of British India. According to Kipling, the English-educated Indian elite, who were the native subordinates in the PWD, were neither of nor sympathetic to the craft tradition and would only help in its demise. Kipling was also critical of the training at the Roorkee College of Engineering, which was founded in 1847 and was the oldest engineering college in the empire. Of this college, Kipling noted that, quote, not a single native draftsman turned out from this school has been taught the architecture of the country, end quote. So even though Indian engineers received no training in the architecture of India, it is possible that some of them sought to educate themselves on the subject. Marzban, for instance, toured North India in 1872 and South India in 1891. In 1873, he gave an illustrated lecture in Gujarati at the Gyan Prasarak Mandali on architecture. Yet it is unlikely that this self-education gave Marzban anything close to the understanding of the craftsman's knowledge of the symbolic, ritual, social, and cultural aspects of design. His travels in India did not cause Marzban to experiment with Indic styles. Even if he had been interested in incorporating Indic forms in his architecture, as a native, he would have known that he did not have the authority to experiment with architectural style in his official capacity. Rather than symbolizing his mastery of Indian tradition or the demonstration of an ideology, it would simply reveal him to be backward or traditional. Marzban designed few buildings in the 1870s and would have been mastering or copying Gothic architecture during this period. It is likely that he saw Western styles as modern and progressive during this period. Modern and progressive, and desired to emulate them. Even if Marzban had read A.W.N. Pugin and John Ruskin, it is difficult to see how he could have been sympathetic to their ideas, nor would the relationship of Gothic architecture to Christianity have been necessarily attractive to a Zoroastrian. The success of Marzban's entire education and career was predicated on the demise of the craftsman's control of building. Western styles then may have meant very little, perhaps simply enlightenment and progress. But as I will demonstrate, this vacuum in meaning would be filled over time as these buildings reflected very real transformations in social and cultural practices. So you have British architects who wanted to wrest control of the building process from engineers, while Kipling and others of his ilk wanted native builders to regain control of the building process. British military and civil engineers controlled the PWD, and the native engineer wanted a foot in the door. The native engineers of India were sympathetic to European styles, had usually rudimentary knowledge of Indian building traditions, represented castes that had benefited from British rule and education, and since they brought little that was native from their tradition to do their work, the native in the native engineer expressed at least two things: his subaltern position in the colonial hierarchy and his ability to act as an intermediary between the rulers and those who worked on engineering projects. In 1886, Queen Victoria's Secretary of State requested the creation of a commission to reconsider the issue of admission of natives to the covenanted civil service. And Marzban was one of the witnesses, and he gave his evidence in 1887. And here he judiciously weighed the relative merits of native and European engineers. Marzban describes how native engineers acted as intermediaries between the European engineer and the contractors and his workers in managing a practical situation, and suggests that native engineers had a greater ability to detect fraud, and although it's not mentioned directly, to deal with the contractor, use the right language, and to ensure that things were done correctly. In judging that, in quote, the efficiency of their works, there is not much difference, end quote, he was concluding that despite their different strengths, the European and native engineers were equal. Part 2, Anglo Indian Architecture and Engineers. Just as architects were concerned with Anglo Indian architecture, so were engineers. And yet each emerging profession had overlapping but different concerns. Architects primarily with aesthetics, and engineers with the physics of construction. Whereas architects were interested in the meaning of style, as illustrated in the discussions covered in their professional journals, engineers were conscious of the style they used, but their professional journals did not dwell on the meaning of style. According to Del Upton, while style is thought to present an, quote, underlying mental temperament, end quote, it's more often a result of accepted conventions arising from functional necessities that help to resolve certain technical problems. At the same time, engineers measured their worth on their resolution of technical problems. In the second half of the 19th century, it was engineers rather than architects that designed most of Bombay's public architecture, and of the engineers, no one worked on a larger number of public buildings than did Marzaban, who also designed many of them. Many of the engineers who design buildings, these buildings are now sort of regarded as architecturally successful. But as a native engineer, Marzaban has not received the same kind of attention. However, while some of the buildings he designed, such as the building for the Elphinstone College and the State Record Office, opened in 1889, that you see to your left, this is where the Bombay Archives are also housed, and the Bairamji Jijiboy Parsi Charitable Institution, built in 1909, that you see to your right. While these are both handsome and well-proportioned buildings, the purpose of this account is not to rehabilitate Marzaban's reputation as an architect whose great design talents have been wrongly overlooked. By aesthetic design standards, the plans, spaces, and details of most of his buildings are practical and ordinary. If architecture was considered by engineers to be mere copying, it is hardly surprising that Marzaban's biography highlights his abilities in the science of building. He may have copied Gothic details in his architectural designs, much as an architect did, but as an engineer, he showed skill and took pride in solving structural problems, thereby assisting in the advance of engineering. Two incidents treated in his biography reveal that Marzaban saw himself not only at par with, but also superior to Europeans as an engineer. In 1874, he went on leave and traveled for over 7 months in the continent and England. He went specifically to Dundee to examine a large bridge then under construction that spanned the River Tay. His son notes that in his diary, Marzaban had recorded his fear that the bridge was poorly designed and would soon collapse. However, he did not have the courage to voice his fears before the notable engineers who had designed the bridge. Marzaban's concerns proved to be prescient as the bridge collapsed soon after. So here we see that Marzaban was unable to voice his apprehensions, but just by observing the bridge, he could detect flaws in its design, right? So it shows someone who really has a really acute engineering sensibility. And so he could see this even though you had these supposedly superior engineers who designed the bridge and they couldn't detect it, but he could, just by seeing it, the bridge, see these flaws. The second incident recorded in Marzaban's biography has to do with the General Post Office, located near the Flora Fountain and used since 1914 as an adjunct to the General Telegraph Office. The construction of this building was based on designs sent out from England by an English architect. The building was designed in such a way that the entire weight of the upper 2 floors was to fall on the substructure of the ground floor, comprised of columns and arches. As the building construction commenced, according to these plans sent out from England, Marzaban alerted his superior officer of the inherent weakness of the understructure. When work on the superstructure of the 2 upper floors was almost complete and work on roofing had begun, the inadequacy of the stone columns became clear. One had a complete vertical crack. Realizing that a structural collapse would tarnish the reputation of the PWD, Marzaban took matters in his own hands and immediately replaced the cracked column with a new one. As he was in the process of supervising the repairs, the chief engineer and secretary to government, Sir Michael Kennedy, and Mr. Hart, the executive engineer, appeared on the scene. Noticing the dangerous nature of the construction, they rebuked Marzaban for embarking on this work without getting permission. And so this was followed by a stern letter in reply to which Marzaban stated that he was concerned that if the columns failed, it would not only create a scare, but it would also impugn the reputation of the PWD. Not long after the fractured column had been replaced, then several other columns were found to be fractured because of the excessive weight of the superstructure. People in Bombay began to talk about how the post office building was collapsing, and the matter even reached the attention of the governor. It was then decided that the 8 columns beneath the 2 upper floors should be replaced, and Marzaban was put in charge of that. It was a risky enterprise, and several Indian and European engineers, the chief engineer, the executive engineer, all of them stopped by to actually see how he was proceeding with this. And Marzaban's successful resolution of the structural crisis resulted in his promotion. So here we see Marzaban portrayed as a heroic and loyal figure who, by his daring and ingenuity, saved this building from sure collapse. And this was an endeavor that was followed closely by both Indian and European engineers in order to learn how this was done. In his desire to safeguard the reputation of his department, he was revealed to be loyal to the British government. The 2 examples of Marzaban's engineering expertise are also notable, since they do not impugn the reputation of his European superiors in Bombay, since the architect and engineers at fault resided in Europe. The veracity of these incidents is not important, so it doesn't really matter if he's just sort of in hindsight coming up with these stories. What's important is what they seem to indicate. While remaining loyal to the colonial government, it appears that the tutelage of the British was no longer necessary, for Marzaban at least, as these incidents reveal him to be at the top of his game, not just in Bombay, but also in the empire. Part 3, The Intermediary, A Life on the Middle Veranda. I concentrate on Marzaban's official career to examine his meteoric rise and his role in the construction of Victorian Bombay. Marzaban's abilities as an engineer, his facility in nurturing mentors, the wide range of official activities he undertook that made him indispensable to the colonial elite, his role as an intermediary between the government and Parsi philanthropists, and his membership in Masonic lodges all contributed to his success. In other words, if we accept that Marzaban was an excellent engineer, what is otherwise striking was his ability to participate in diverse, though sometimes overlapping, arenas and networks of power. By examining Marzaban's varied involvements, I will shed light on how we might understand what meaning many members of Bombay's citizenry would have read into his public buildings. The successful intermediary. Marzaban's career was greatly aided by various European mentors who are gratefully acknowledged in his biography, which also contains photographs of many of these gentlemen. And you see 2 of them in these images. To your left is Reverend E.I. Howard, Director of Public Instruction, Bombay Presidency, and to your right is General J.F. Fuller, who was previously Secretary of the Architectural Improvement Committee of Bombay. All of Marzaban's mentors appreciated his abilities, and they attempted to reward him by a commendation, pay increase, or the offer of a job. While he was working in Pune in the 1860s, he came into almost daily contact with Sir Bartle Frere, the famous governor of Bombay, who told Marzaban of his plans to erect a new city of Bombay, and he asked Marzaban to take the job of assistant to the architect who was to direct this transformation. And you have this huge transformation of Bombay in the 1860s, and so you have Marzaban being invited right at the beginning of this process. So in other words, you see that Marzaban was acquainted with and worked closely with powerful men who were at the forefront of the creation of a new Bombay. Marzaban was undoubtedly a bright student and excellent professional. However, one of his strengths was his ability to cultivate influential mentors who were favorably disposed towards his advancement. Marzaban was a Parsi, as were the majority of Bombay's leading philanthropists. And we know of at least one case where Marzaban acted as an intermediary between Parsi philanthropists and the government. In August 1887, he wrote to the government regarding the foundation of an obstetric hospital in Bombay, towards which some anonymous donors wished to offer a sum of 60,000 rupees. And it was only after their offer was accepted that the names were revealed as members of the reputable, well-known Allbless family. So Marzaban designed the Bamanji Allbless Obstetric Hospital, which was opened in 1891, that you see to your left. And this hospital was located in the compound of the Pesanji Homenji Karma Hospital for Women and Children, which was opened in 1886 and was also designed by him. The Karma family was long associated with social reform, as were the Marzaban family. And in fact, Marzaban's grandfather, Fardunji Marzaban, had set the reform agenda for the Karma family. In his non-official capacity, Marzaban had worked on the Allbless Bagh that you see to your right. And the Allbless Bagh was a community institution for Parsis that was founded by the Allbless family in 1868. In the 1880s, Marzaban had already spearheaded a campaign to found a hospital for the exclusive use of Parsis, which fell through. However, the Allbless family not only contributed towards a residential building, but also paid for the establishment of a dispensary attached to Marzaban's scheme for cheap residential quarters for poor Parsis in 1887. And in some ways, Marzaban is the father of forming these Parsi colonies, which I won't have time to talk about today, but he started this process in the 1880s. Marzaban was a trustee on many Parsi charitable funds and subsequently designed some public buildings associated with major trustees. Because of these connections, one cannot help wondering whether these Parsi philanthropists specifically requested that Marzaban design these buildings. Engineers in India had to work on a variety of projects, including architectural projects, sanitation, reclamation, sewage disposal, and layouts. Marzaban's work encompassed this great variety of jobs and more. More relevant to Marzaban's professional success was his ability to make himself indispensable to the colonial elite of Bombay, to those occupying the upper veranda, by organizing fairs, fetes, official visits, exhibitions, and many other public functions. These were usually events of a temporary nature, but necessary in marking and publicizing the achievements of each governor and other senior officials in office, and also in celebrating imperial authority and empire by hosting official visits. Even though senior government officials would have been familiar with his ongoing projects of a permanent nature, it was through these impermanent projects and events that Marzaban would have cultivated power on an ongoing basis. Through enabling these events, Marzaban's transient and impermanent projects made his expertise necessary and visible to those in power, while at the same time bringing him in close personal contact with the colonial elite. So, for example, Lady Harris, the wife of the governor, held several elaborate fancy fetes at the government house at Malabar Hill to raise money for various institutions. And Marzaban played a central role in organizing these events, and then was gratefully acknowledged by Lady Harris in a letter in 1892. In its review of these fetes, the well-known daily, The Times of India, in 1892, acknowledged that in the absence of Marzaban, quote, no fancy fair in Bombay could be complete, end quote. So here we see Marzaban's contribution being acknowledged not only by the governor's wife, but also by an influential daily. A quote from the Advocate of India from 1890, which discusses Marzaban's role in enabling the visit of Prince Albert Victor, gives one a sense of Marzaban's very observable hand conducting most of Bombay's official public events, where both his presence and his orchestration of these events was visible to everybody. So Marzaban's success lay partially in his ability to be indispensable to those in power. And such a course of action was certainly not exclusive to those who were colonized. However, since other avenues of cultivating power were less readily available to the colonized middle, making oneself visible and indispensable to those in power was an important route for anyone with ambition. Brotherly love and the cult of Freemasonry. Under colonial rule, the colonized elite and colonized middle would find themselves excluded from centers of sociality and arenas of social mobility, such as the exclusive clubs where the colonial elite would gather. However, there was an alternative space, the spaces of the secretive and exclusive Freemasonry Brotherhood, where elite male members of European and native societies would interact. Soon after coming to Bombay, Marzaban was elected as a member of the Lodge Rising Star in 1863. So, what was the importance of Freemasonry to the imperial project, and what was its relationship to religion? Freemasonry bound its brothers from different races and religious communities together in the British Empire, both of which was headed by the British monarchy, loyalty to whom was expected of a Freemason. Even though Freemasonry was not a religion, the historian Wahid Jalil Fozdar argues that it had many of the characteristics of a universal church. Furthermore, Freemasonry was replete with rituals, many of which came to serve the imperial state, such as the deployment of Masonic rituals at foundation stone laying ceremonies, where loyalty to the crown and state, forward-looking ideals, and an inclusive religion was encouraged. Marzaban played a central role in facilitating the visits of royalty and ceremonies accompanying the laying of foundation stones. It would have been especially gratifying to have the monarchy participate in ceremonies for buildings that were designed by him as an architect or as an engineer. Here, his participation would not simply be instrumental, but a reflection of his commitment to the ideals of Freemasonry and loyalty to the British monarchy, which was the head of the craft. So the Lodge Rising Star of Western India was founded in 1843 and was the first Indian lodge under European constitution in all of Asia. James Burns was the leading spirit behind the foundation of the lodge, and one of his central aims was to enroll natives, particularly those employed by the government. As many British government officials were already Freemasons, the inclusion of natives resulted over time in an additional expansion of Masons in the Bombay government. However, until 1872, when 4 Hindus were admitted, only 1 Jain had been admitted to the lodge. In contrast, its membership included a number of Muslims and many Parsis. This was the result of the low esteem in which Hinduism, with its caste system and idolatry, was held by many Britons in India and also many Masons. In Bombay, apart from Marzaban, all the early native engineers who are mentioned have Hindu-sounding names like Vasudev, Bapuji Kanetkar, Makund Ramchandra, and they would not have been eligible for membership in the Masonic Lodge until 1872. So why is their exclusion significant, and what are the implications of Marzaban's membership in the Masonic Lodge in terms of his career? Freemasonry imparted to its members social values that were dear to the bourgeois and nascent global capitalist economy, such as punctuality, a realization of the importance of time and labor, desirable forms of recreation, the value of keeping one's word, and civility. In British India, such desirable social values were condensed into that indefinable quality known as character, by which the British colonial authorities judged how much they should allow Indians to take part as equals in governing the Indian empire. The central importance given to character in Freemasonry meant that it permitted the British to have faith in Indian Freemasons by giving them charge of important positions both inside and outside the lodge. As a Freemason, Marzaban then would have been considered to be a person of character, entrusted with positions of authority in the Masonic Lodge, and probably more trustworthy than his native peers who were not Freemasons in his work at the PWD. Freemasonry provided a unique platform where the colonizer and the colonized interacted as equals, as brothers, even loving each other as brothers. This would have given Marzaban a confidence in himself and inculcated a certain ease in his interactions with the colonial elite and in conducting public ceremonials, qualities that were assets in the world outside the Masonic Lodge. It is hardly surprising that Marzaban was confident of his engineering abilities and could detect faults in the work of European engineers when he was given positions of authority in the Masonic Lodge and interacted with the colonial elite as an equal. The spaces of the Masonic lodges, spaces from which most of his native colleagues would have been excluded, would bring Marzaban close to the colonial elite. And it is likely that Marzaban had successfully mastered the distinctions between the two worlds, acting as an equal to his European brothers in Masonic lodges and with the correct deference to his superiors in the profane world as expected of all Masons. So he could move between these two worlds in the right manner. Freemasonry, with its by and large elite membership, was certainly a route to social and professional mobility, but I do not mean to imply that Marzaban's membership in this brotherhood was for purely instrumental reasons. Marzaban's grandfather, Fardunji Marzaban, founder of the Gujarati printing press and of Gujarati journalism in India, wrote approvingly of Freemasonry in his newspaper columns in 1823, and he brought it for the first time to the attention of Indians. In the second half of the 19th century, most Indian lodges were dominated by Parsis, but also included the educated elite, knights, baronets from other religious groups, while the membership of the European lodges might include such distinguished personages as the governor of Bombay. So really quite a powerful group. In Europe, Freemasonry has been seen as important in establishing Enlightenment ideas, and then later, Freemasonry helped to transport these ideas to India. Not surprisingly, many Indian Freemasons took a leadership role in setting out to transform their own communities and purge them of superstition, caste, and other supposedly irrational ideas. It is likely that Marzaban would have been associated with reform movements in the Parsi community. At the same time, as an architect and engineer in the PWD, these worlds intersected in other ways as well. Manakji Kursetji, a Parsi and the founding member of Lodge Rising Star, has been described as, quote, the foremost pioneer of English education for native girls, end quote. And he was responsible for founding the Alexandra Native Girls English Institution. In its focus on universal standards of ethics, this school was based on the ideals of Freemasonry. The institute came to be housed in a new Gothic building that you see here, designed for it by Marzaban and was opened in 1881. Marzaban's engagement with this building was not simply professional. It is likely that Marzaban was personally engaged with the issues of social reform that this institution symbolized, and it is relevant that these reforms in female education were being spearheaded by a fellow Parsi and also by a brother Mason. Marzaban was in charge of the plans and organization of a fancy fair held in 1889 to raise money for the Alexandra Institution. So Marzaban's engagement with this institution was multifaceted. He designed it, helped raise money for it, and as a free Mason was sympathetic to its aims. As a native, there would have been many barriers to his advancement. On the other hand, as a native who was both a Parsi and a Freemason and came from a prominent family long associated with social and religious reform, there were many incentives for his advancement. And certainly few European architects and engineers would have had such a multifaceted engagement with institutions as Marzaban did. If, as Kipling argued, Western styles symbolized enlightenment and progress for the Western educated elite, then Marzaban, and most likely other social reformers and patrons, would have been proud of the hospitals and schools designed by him and sheathed in the Gothic revival style. But this would not merely be a facile fascination with surface appearances, a shallow admiration for symbols of the colonizer. Instead, these new institutions would visually symbolize a reformed and hence purified community, cleansed of at least some of its superstitions and falsehoods. As a result of community reforms, Parsis, for example, came to believe that they were returning to the purer form of their culture, purged from the polluting accretions such as superstitions absorbed from Hinduism over the years. Rather than simply colonial imposition, social reform resulted from hard-won battles within communities, hence allowing the transformations to be viewed as community pride by those who approved of them. The new ways of building, the Gothic revival architecture designed by new professionals rather than craftsmen, were to be the containers for new ways of being. Gothic revival architecture would outwardly symbolize the transformed and reformed subjects that would use them. The enlightened patrons were symbols of the progress in the enlightenment of the community they hailed from. Let us take the example of the Karma and the All Blessed hospitals, institutions that came to be part of the same complex designed in the Gothic revival style by Marzaban. The design of these handsome hospital buildings, which were, architecturally speaking, derivative rather than innovative, tell us little about the meaning they held. To understand the very real social change underpinning these institutions, we need to turn briefly to the story of the foundation of the Karma Hospital. G.T. Kittredge and Dr. Mrs. Hogans established the Medical Women's Fund in Bombay in the 1880s to collect funds for the medical education of females. The fund found few subscribers at first, and then P.H. Karma gave a huge donation of 1,64,000 rupees. Karma excoriated Hindu traders for their indifference, quote, and expressed rather ruefully that it would be long before the well-to-do Hindus would, as a body, look upon the female medical movement as one that appealed to their pockets as well as to their sympathies, end quote. Following this donation, Karma proposed the foundation of a hospital paid for by him, whose medical staff would be exclusively female, as long as the government would provide a site and the maintenance of the hospital in perpetuity. So the Karma Hospital symbolized revolutionary changes, a hospital for women, staffed entirely by women. It's unlikely that all Parsis were behind Karma's scheme. However, his philanthropy and remarks showed the Parsi community to be more progressive than other communities, such as the Hindus. In terms of architectural style, perhaps Marzaban was, as Kipling implied of others of his ilk, one of many who were mere copyists and tracers. However, Marzaban's buildings had the ability to transform the meaning of Gothic revival architecture. Marzaban could be read as either or both a native and Parsi engineer, an architect of public buildings funded by natives that were expressions of social reform. However, Marzaban, by his own example, demonstrated that Indians were capable of designing and constructing substantial buildings on their own that looked no different from those buildings designed by British engineers. But was there anything special about Gothic revival architecture for Indians, or would any architectural style work as well in its place? Gothic revival architecture was, of course, the style used by the government for new public buildings. However, I would argue that there was nothing special about Gothic revival architecture. Any Western style that seemed to speak to the present and the future would symbolize enlightenment and progress and work just as well. This does not suggest a shallow engagement with architectural style, but merely that profound social changes in Indian society required to be housed in buildings whose architectural style was considered to be symbolic of modernity and progress. If some of Marzaban's superiors considered him to have greater abilities than other native engineers senior to him, we find him competing and winning the position of executive engineer of the Municipal Corporation of Bombay in 1892 over other rivals, including a European, Mr. Tomlinson, deputy engineer of the Bombay Municipal Water Works. The social reformer Bairamji Merwanji Malabari saw Marzaban's victory as being the first native Indian to be elected to this position as a victory for self-government. In the early stages of Marzaban's career in Bombay, we saw him being compared to native engineers, while at the end of his career in government, by the 1890s, Marzaban's qualities were contrasted to his European peers and found by many to be superior. This shift signified a desire by the native elite to assume the reins of self-government rather than simply act as intermediaries for Europeans. Such moves were often spearheaded by Masons, many of whom were early nationalists who, having achieved leadership positions in the Masonic bureaucracy, wanted a similar parity in government administration in the so-called profane world. Like Marzaban, all native engineers would have been embedded in a local context. These local engagements would alter the way they viewed their work and the meaning of their constructions. The native engineer was not simply an intermediary between the British and the workers, but was an individual with dense local connections whose own community, as well as the larger native community, was experiencing an accelerated rate of change. And this would result in a more multifaceted engagement with the city than that available to European engineers. So to conclude, the history of British architecture in India is constructed under the general thematic where British architects familiar with British architectural developments as illustrated on the pages of the Builder and the Building News designed and thought, while Indian engineers and craftsmen enabled their visions to be constructed. The dominant paradigm in the writing of architectural histories is the tracing of the arc of connections, references, influences, quotations, the hard work of thinking that makes architecture into an art, albeit a practical art. Marzaban did not simply superintend the construction of buildings in Bombay, but was the architect of several Victorian buildings in Bombay. And perhaps he too hungrily perused and plundered the pages of the Builder and the Building News. With great effort, one too could carve a space for Marzaban within this history. A history that closely traces the genealogy of designs has a role to play, but this account of Marzaban is not such a history, nor would it suffice. Instead, I have shown that it is only by looking at the complex networks of Marzaban's engagements that one can begin to understand what his buildings might have meant not only to him, but also to the local population. Rather than a search for the meaning of Marzaban's building in a self-referential history of architecture, it is the multifaceted local contextual engagements that gave his building their meaning. Native engineers were certainly marginalized and at a disadvantage. On the other hand, they were deeply involved in the transformation of a landscape that was theirs, a feeling very few Europeans in similar positions with transferable jobs and a home in England, in Britain, could have. Talented and well-connected, Marzaban appears to have been at the right place at the right time. While this may have been true, he appears to have had the skill and the desire to grasp every opportunity that came his way. Other native engineers may have been equally or perhaps even more talented than Marzaban, but perhaps lacked the political skills which are so necessary to the achievement of success. So Marzaban thus emerges as an ambitious individual with the technical, political, and social skills to get ahead of other Indian engineers and later even challenge Europeans. Marzaban represented the group, Baba's mimic men, educated according to Maucaulay's Minute, who were to act as intermediaries between the colonial authorities and those they governed over. Homi Bhabha has argued that, quote, colonial mimicry is the desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is almost the same but not quite, end quote. Certainly in his attire, in his photographs that you see to the left, he is always seen with his turban. So Marzaban would have visibly been a hybrid subject, almost the same but not quite. Parsis, who increasingly saw themselves as distinct from other natives, other Indian natives, still fell short of being Europeans. And yet, Marzaban's architectural designs do not show an excess, a difference. Whether this came from an acute and accurate perception that architectural excess would have been inexcusable from him, or whether his sensibility as an engineer introduced a natural restraint is impossible to say. Barber emphasizes the destabilizing qualities of excess, where mimicry might be seen as mockery and hence threatening to the colonizer. However, Marzaban's abilities as an architect and engineer to reproduce adequate modern public buildings that gave no hint of the origins of its designer could also have been perceived as a threat. The British in India responded to this threat by insisting on seeing native engineers as mere copyists, a group who could be seen as a type, who needed no individual account of their careers. Marzaban's son biography of his father is a refusal of anonymity for his father, just as this account is. Thank you.